All right, hopefully you guys have your study guide for the test. I am going to give you everything you need to know on here, but you are going to have to take notes. So I will talk slow and you can fill in answers. You're going to turn this study guide in. It is a grade, and then you will have a test that I will link as well in the portal or in the group me. Not or, and. I will link them in both places. So make sure you have your study guide and a pencil ready. All right, question number 1. 2 railroad companies commissioned to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The first one was the Union Pacific Railroad. The second one was the Central Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific began laying track headed west. The Central Pacific began heading east. They met, it's called the Driving of the Golden Spike. The 2 railroads met on May 10th, 1869 at a place called Promontory Point, Promontory, and it's in Utah. Who invented the sleeping car? His name was George Pullman, Pullman. Let me give you a hint. Don't just learn their first names. I had a kid come in and take a test, and there were like 5 different Johns, and he had no idea which was which. So learn first and last names. So George Pullman invented the sleeping car. George Westinghouse introduced the air brake. Westinghouse, Westinghouse. Number 5, Casey Jones. In 1900, Casey Jones was driving a train, and he died with one hand on the throttle and another one on the brake, trying to save the lives of all of his passengers on his train. They called it the Cannonball. And he went down as a hero, died to save the passengers on his train. All right, number 6. Where was gold discovered in 1858? And it was at Pikes Peak. This is when multitudes began coming to this area. They have this motto, Pikes Peak or Bust. So Pikes, P-I-K-E-S, apostrophe S, Peak. What 2 factors greatly encouraged Western settlement at the end of the Civil War? The first one was called the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was probably the most important factor to stimulate Western settlement. Congress passed it in 1862, and basically the Homestead Act, you probably want to write this down, said that a settler could get up to 160 acres of land. All they had to do was live on the land for 5 years and make improvements. So they couldn't just like sit on the land and do nothing. For 5 years, they had to be living on it and improving it. And then after 5 years, they'd pay $10 and they would own the land. So Homestead Act of 1862. The second factor was this extension of the railroads. It made travel much, much easier and much, much quicker to the west. Okay, there were a couple of different types of prairie homes. The first one were called dugouts, and basically a dugout was literally dug into the side of a hill or like a ravine. And the second one was a sod, S-O-D, house, where thick layers of sod had to be plowed up. It was then cut into sections, I've read about 3 feet long. They sort of made them into sod bricks. They were laid in place, and these were what formed walls, and then they were stuck together with mud. A lot of the times they would use, in place of firewood, basically if they would run out of firewood, they would use corn cobs, dried corn husks. Sometimes they'd even twist hay. There's a section in Laura Ingalls' books where she talks about her dad twisting hay literally every, 5 minutes because it would just burn up or they would freeze to death. Staple food of prairie families was corn. It was easy to grow, easy to harvest, and they could use it for a variety of things. What section of America became known as the breadbasket? I don't think we really talked about this before, but it was the Great Plains. This area was just perfect for growing the grains that were needed for making bread. Question 11 says, whose flour mills became the largest in the world? And that was, excuse me, Pillsbury. John S. Pillsbury. He was in Minneapolis, and he built the largest flour mills in the world. This has nothing to do with any of this, but one of the coolest things in all of my study of history, during the Great Depression, flour used to come in cloth sacks, and things got so bad during the Great Depression that people couldn't even afford cloth for clothes. They began turning flour sacks into dresses, and when the flour mills learned of this, they began printing flowery patterns on their flour sacks so that little girls and little boys who were having to wear flour sack clothes could have pretty clothes. I just think that's one of the coolest things on the planet. So if you have time, just Google flour sack dresses, because they were actually pretty cute patterns. So, all right. What was the Oklahoma land rush? In 1889, Oklahoma had settled, and they were trying to bring in settlers. So they had this thing that we now call the Oklahoma land rush, and they began sending out flyers for free land. And so basically, in this territory, it had formerly been an Indian reservation. In 1889, it was opened up for white settlement. And on April 22nd, about 50,000, what we now called boomers, or we also call them 89ers because the year was 1889, they lined up, 50,000 people, some on horseback, some in covered wagons, some just gonna run, and they ran, and every person who was part of the land rush had a flag, and every plot had a flag, and when you found the plot of land that you wanted, you pulled up the flag and you put your number in, and that became your land. And that's really one of the biggest ways that Oklahoma was settled, through the Oklahoma land rush. All right, then we have this thing, and you guys did a reading assignment on this. We haven't really discussed this, but as white settlers are coming in, they're just legitimately taking Indian territory or Native American territory, and it really was pretty awful. And of course, like most humans would, you end up with a slew of Native Americans trying to protect their land, and you end up with these things called, this particular one of the Sioux Wars, the Sioux Indians. It lasted about a year. And the Sioux Wars last 1876 to 1877. They were in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. The most famous battle of this war was fought in June of 1876. It was at Little Bighorn, is what the battle was called. Little Bighorn, and it was at the Little Bighorn River, which that is in Montana. And you have the American, his name was Colonel George Armstrong Custer. And if you remember George Custer, C-U-S-T-E-R, and actually among the Indians there, he was known as the White Chief with Yellow Hair. He had about, I think, 264 men, and they went in to attempt to capture what, unbeknownst to them, was a war party of over 2,000 Sioux warriors, led by their chief. The chief's name was Rain in the Face, and the most popular one, his name was Crazy Horse. So it was Custer against Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Custer, now listen, you're outnumbered. I mean, you have 264 against 2,000. 2,000 warriors. Like, these guys were not playing. And you have what ultimately gets known as Custer's Last Stand. The Sioux Indian took us out. I mean, took the white man out, killed Custer. By the end of the year, though, the Sioux faced defeat. And then, sadly, they agreed to just return to their reservation. I mean, literally, we had gone in, taken their land. They fight back, they lose, and then they agree to just go back on their reservation. All right. Now, later on, if you know me, you know that I love books. And here is a book that did change all of history. There's a book by a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson. And this person published a book. It was called A Century of Dishonor, which that in itself doesn't sound like a super pleasant book. But what the author began to discuss was she began to point out that the Native Americans had been often just treated very unjustly, and really began to bring to light the reality of the way that the Native Americans had been treated. And as a direct result from that, in 1887, Congress passed what we call the Dawes Act. And basically, this broke up tribal lands into separate plots, and it offered 160 acres of land and U.S. citizenship to any head of an Indian family if they wanted to live separate and apart from their tribe. And of course, there was a lot of issues with that too as well, but it was a step towards helping. The problem from my perspective is that they had to separate from their tribe. In my opinion, they're still trying to sort of control that, but that's neither here nor there. Dawes Act offered 160 acres of land and U.S. citizenship. That was in 1887. It was not until 1932 that Congress passed. I'm sorry, 1924. Congress granted full U.S. citizenship to all Indians, and that should say, excuse me, that really should say Native Americans, but you know what I mean. All right, your next question says, name some famous frontier men and women. And we didn't really talk about this, I don't think, and it may have been in some of your reading, but we'll just do a sort of a quick rundown of some of these people. This really did become like the cowboy, and when you think about cowboys and Indians, this is that time period, right? So you have people like Kit Carson, one of the best known heroes of the early American West. When Kit Carson was 15, he left home. He joined a wagon train headed for Santa Fe. He became a hunter. He was hired by a guy to serve as a guide in Western exploration, and became very well known. Kit Carson. Another guy, you're not going to recognize his real name probably. His name was William F. Cody. In 1860, he worked for the Pony Express, and honestly, carrying mail across this untamed land was pretty dangerous. That's sort of a whole nother discussion, but it was not an easy job, and it was really quite dangerous. During the Civil War, he worked as a scout for the Union Army. After the Civil War, he was hired to hunt buffalo to feed the construction workers who were working on the railroad. And it was during that time period that he was hunting buffalo that he became known as Buffalo Bill. Now, his claim is that he killed 4,000 buffalo in 18 months. And I'm not a hunter. I don't want to be a hunter. I don't want to eat food that someone else has hunted. But in my brain, 4,000 buffalo in 18 months is a whole lot of meat to eat. Okay, another one is, Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, Annie Oakley, Jesse James, Billy the Kid. All of these guys are coming out during this time period. So you end up with these mythical figures as well. Pecos Bill, Paul Bunyan began to just sort of take these tall tales that are being told and really begin to explode them into these giant stories. All right, we also have some things during this time period that really begin to make life easier. Sewing machines, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but going from needle and thread to a sewing machine changed a whole bunch of things. Gas lights. Bathrooms. Now, there's obviously been bathrooms, but they've been outhouses. We're now working on indoor bathrooms. Ice boxes, the first type of refrigerators. You have canned foods coming in and making life simpler. The telephone. You have these things called specialty shops where you can now go and go shopping for specific items. That's a brand new thing. The telegraph. Sports becomes a big deal. Baseball, becomes a massively known sport. The typewriter is invented and begins to be used here. Entertainment, things like zoos and P.T. Barnum's circus, and all of these things come into play during this time period. The next question says, who is Alexander Graham Bell? Now, that's sort of a really big question. Here's what you need to know. What you need to know about Alexander Graham Bell is that he patented his first telephone. So Alexander Graham Bell, telephone, 1876. Okay, telephone, 1876. Thomas Edison, you need to know that he was known as the greatest inventor in history. He also had the first modern laboratory. And he is credited with the incandescent electric light bulb, which most historians will tell you that light bulb had the most profound effect in the 20th century. And 20, what was the Centennial Exposition? 1876, 100 years after we declared our independence. We celebrated our centennial, which is 100 years. We had a huge fair, basically, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was covering 236 acres, 160 buildings, 50 foreign nations were represented. It was basically just a big old fair of all of these exhibits set up. Okay. Next question. Who was George Washington Carver? George Washington Carver was maybe the best remembered agricultural scientist. He really revolutionized Southern agriculture. Okay. In the late 19th century, he began to find a bajillion uses for the peanut, for the soybean, for the sweet potato, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it genuinely changed the way that the southern area was able to grow and produce different kind of crops. Totally changed. With most credit him with the peanut. Obviously, he didn't invent the peanut. He just learned how to use the peanut and how to make it grow and how to use it to its fullest potential. But he also did that with the soybean and sweet potatoes. All right. Now, let's talk about some vocabulary here. Capitalism. Capitalism is this economic system where individuals, men and women, are free to follow the pursuits that they see fit. They are able to pursue the jobs that they want. It's also known as free enterprise. We live in a capitalist society. We have the freedom to choose where we work and how we work. Okay. So here's your next question. What were some of the factors that contributed to America's prosperity in the late 19th century? This time of free enterprise and capitalism growing produced a very prosperous America. A couple of reasons. Number one, new inventions. As things are easier to produce, I can produce more of them, therefore I can sell more of them. Number two, we have this massive amount of natural resources. So number one, new inventions. Number two, natural resources. We're finding water and oil and coal and iron and all of these natural resources that were necessary for industrialization. Number three, we have a huge labor supply. Immigrants and Native Americans who were moving from farmlands to cities created this huge labor industry, a labor supply that they could pull from to hire. The fourth thing is surplus capital, which means people had extra money now. They could afford to invest into things for future profit. Prior to this, most people were living on farms just sustaining themselves day to day. Americans are now making a little bit of extra money, and they have the extra finances to invest. The fifth thing is the Civil War had created a need for new industrial goods. So the Civil War sort of jump-started the economy in this way. Number six, we have cheaper transportation. The advances in transportation, mostly the railroad system, allowed for easier marketing of goods. Okay, the next question says, what was the Protestant work ethic? And the Protestant work ethic was this idea that people were working every day in order to honor God, that getting up and going to work was part of their act of worship. And it really did change the sort of attitude of people that I'm not just working to earn a paycheck, I'm working to honor and to please the Lord. Who was Andrew Carnegie? All right. Andrew Carnegie was known for steel. So Andrew Carnegie was the steel guy. Steel as in S-T-E-E-L, not that he's stealing things. He was this entrepreneur, and he became the leading producer of iron and steel in the United States. So you need to know Andrew Carnegie was the steel guy. All right, who was J.P. Morgan? Jonathan Pierpont Morgan was America's wealthiest financier during the 19th century. He was the founder of one of the most influential banking houses in the entire world. His company became the leader in financing America's big business. So you need to know about J.P. Morgan, financer for big business. All right, John D. Rockefeller. He was the oil guy. Carnegie was steel. Rockefeller was oil. He started what we know as the Standard Oil Company, made massive amounts of money in the oil industry. All right, here's some more vocabulary. What is a corporation? A corporation is formed when a group of businessmen they get a charter and they become, sorry, my brain glitched out. Let's try that again. A corporation became a major form of business during this time period. Few businesses owned by individuals or several people could generate the funds needed to promote major financial endeavor. So corporations became predominant during this time period. And that's when a group of businessmen, multiple people, receive what is called a charter of incorporation from the state government, and they create a business with multiple owners. They can raise capital, they can sell stocks, and all of these kinds of things. While we're speaking of that, capital in this sense of a discussion, capital is the money to be used to make more money. If I'm starting a business, the money that I invest is capital. It's money used to make more money. A lot of businesses use stocks. And stocks are basically a little bitty piece of a company. I mean, technically, when you buy stock into a company, you become part owner of the corporation. And what happens is I buy stocks at a certain price. If that company begins to make more money, the value of my stock goes up. If they begin to lose money, my value goes down. And you have, I can sell, I can buy, I can do stock trading and those kinds of things and make some pretty good money if I'm good at it. What is a stockholder? A stockholder is the person who purchases the stock. At the moment, I own stock in Coca-Cola and in, I think Amazon. I'm not positive, but I become a stockholder when I purchase stocks. Okay, what are dividends? Dividends are profits. So as a business prospers, a stockholder earns dividends, which is a profit on each one of his shares. I own a share, it's worth so much money, and that money that I make, the profit are my dividends. Okay, a proprietorship is when a business is owned by one individual. Proprietorship is when a business is owned by one individual. A partnership is a business owned by two or more partners. Jumping to a completely different topic is the Chinese Exclusion Act. And remember, the Chinese Exclusion Act, we did a thing on it. In 1882, Congress passes what's called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned any Chinese laborers from entering the United States for 10 years. And this whole idea that we're facing right now with the border and letting immigrants in and letting these, that's nothing new. Okay, and what kind of irritates me about the Chinese Exclusion Act is we brought them in and we promised them work and we did all of these things, and then we banned them from entering for 10 years. Little bit different in what's happening right now, but that's another conversation for another time. And then question 35, the Statue of Liberty. Okay, the Statue of Liberty was given to us in 1886 from France. It was a gift from France, and probably that's kind of all you will need to know for your test. As all of these immigrants are coming in, you know, minus the Chinese laborers, and actually that was kind of later on, as immigration is just sort of hitting this peak during this time period, as people are selling their farms and moving into cities, you end up with some problems. Cities were growing faster than they could keep up with. You have housing issues. Good housing was very scarce. A lot of times very poor quality. Apartments were super small. They were cramped super close together. Crowded living conditions, this lack of knowledge at the time period about good health practices. Of course, we see this rapid rise of disease. Sewer sanitation systems were kind of non-existent in so many of these places, which of course leads to the rapid spread of disease. Wood was the chief building material during this time period, so fires were numerous. The Great Chicago Fire was probably one of the most well-known, and in 1871, there was this Great Chicago Fire. Legend has it that Mrs. Patrick O'Leary's cow knocked a lantern over in the barn and burned down a huge amount of Chicago. What are settlement houses? All right, settlement houses were pretty cool. And these were started off as daycares, but basically a settlement house was a house set up where immigrants or impoverished people could come in, and programs, it kind of reminds me of maybe like a YMCA in that there was a house, you could come live in there. It started off as a daycare. Women dropped their kids off so they could go to work. Ultimately, it ends up with opportunities for education, for classes on health and nutrition and music and sewing. In times of trouble, these houses were always available to help people get back on their feet and to educate them so they could do better for themselves. One of the most famous settlement houses was founded by a lady named Jane Addams. She it was called Hull House, And it was just this old mansion in the center of Chicago's slum district. It opened in 1889, and it really was meant to help immigrants get on their feet and get settled so they could better themselves. Louis Sullivan was the father of the modern skyscraper. Now, when I think of skyscrapers now, I think of huge, tall buildings. This was 29 stories high, which is still pretty big. I mean, we're talking about the, 19th century and late 1800s. It's a pretty big deal for that time period. All right, 41. What are labor organizations? Many Americans of this late 19th century joined clubs, societies, or these almost like fraternal organizations with other people of like trade. This was not a new idea, actually. So labor organizations were groups of people from the same labor industry coming together to work together. Kind of the first step to labor unions we have today. We all know what strikes are, which is just refusal to work. I'm in a company, I'm demanding better pay grades, and I'm demanding more vacation. And if I'm part of the labor union there, we go on strike, we refuse to work until some demands are met, or at least considered and met in the middle. Temperance movement. The temperance movement was a fight to remove alcohol. So many people thought that alcohol was like the worst of the worst. And the reality is, as I studied this time period, there were so many violent issues due to alcohol. When life is hard and all these issues are happening, people were turning to alcohol and getting very ugly. So we have this temperance movement to remove the sin of liquor. Okay, what was women's suffrage? Women's suffrage was the right for women to vote. What was the Grange? Okay, let me get there in my notes here. So, you have cowboys and farmers and these men working on the bottom ground, right there. You have farmers, and in 1867. There's this guy named Oliver H. Kelly. You don't need to know his name. He's an employee of the Department of Agriculture, and he develops, it's a better word, this National Association of Farmers. They're actually called the Patrons of Husbandry. Husbandry is this fancy word for like farmers and getting out and working the land. They call this association the Grange. I'm going to come back and reiterate exactly what you need to write down, but here's what happened. 1875, you have about 20,000 Grange organizations, about 1.5 million members. And the whole idea was that this gave a chance for farmers to come in and to discuss cultural activities. It gave them a chance to sort of bounce ideas off of each other and to work together to grow their farms. They really got very politically invested because so much of their financial issues were because of the way people were voting that they had no say in. And so during this time period, they got very, very invested in politics. So what you need to know is the Grange was a national association of farmers. National Association of Farmers. All right, so the next one is inflation. Inflation is this process in which the supply of money is increased and therefore the value of money declines. So inflation is when money supply is increased and therefore money value goes down, which just makes sense because the reason things are valuable is because there's not very many of them. If there were 15,000 original Mona Lisas, it wouldn't be worth anything, or 15 million or whatever, but there's only one, so therefore it's valuable. So inflation, more money, value decreases. Greenbacks. So during the Civil War, the government began to put paper money into circulation that had no gold or silver backing, and those were called greenbacks because they were just a piece of paper with no extra with no value backing it. You know, used to, if I had a certain amount of money, I could exchange that for an equal amount of gold or silver. That's no longer the situation, but greenbacks were just paper money print issued that had no gold or silver backing it. Okay, let's work our way through a couple of the presidents that we talked about. Some of them we don't really need to know very much about. Others we'll talk about a couple of things. Ulysses S. Grant, he was president from 1869 to 1877. 1869 to 1877. His whole goal was to reunite the nation after the Civil War. You know, you have one nation fighting a North and a South against each other, and there was this massive separation, which makes sense because they had just been fighting this war against each other. And Ulysses S. Grant comes in and really did his best, from what I can tell, to reunite the nation. Rutherford B. Hayes was president from 1877 to 1881. And his desire, so he was known to favor government reform. Hold on, let me start that sentence over. Okay, Hayes was known to favor or to approve more of government reform, and sort of had this desire, and this is a quote, the distinction between North and South in our country to be totally gone away. You know, Ulysses S. Grant came in and began to work on uniting the United States. Rutherford B. Hayes comes in and just sort of continues to walk in those steps, and really wanted at this level to be no distinction anymore between North and South. Okay. But here, excuse me, here's really what you need to know about Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes was best remembered for his attempts to reform civil service program. His attempt to reform the civil service program. He really made this very determined effort to base the hiring of government employees on merit or on deserving it rather than political owing somebody. So basically, a lot of times, if I become president and I have this political tie to somebody, I was just hiring these people. I was putting them into my presidential cabinet. And the reality is a lot of those guys had absolutely no basis whatsoever to serve in that field. You know, I'm hiring a Secretary of Agriculture because they helped me out in the war. And then my Secretary of Agriculture, or whatever that position would be called, has no idea what they're doing. And so Rutherford B. Hayes attempts to reform the civil service program. Basically, he began to say, I'm going to hire someone based on what they can do, not based on what basically they owe me or I owe them. All right. Rutherford B. Hayes, also his wife was Lemonade Lucy. You don't need to know this for your test coming up, but Lemonade Lucy, his wife, refused to sell alcohol. She was part of this temperance movement, and so she refused to sell alcohol to these visitors. She began to serve lemonade, and she became known as Lemonade Lucy. All right, James A. Garfield. He was president in 1881, and that's it. He was the last president to be born in a log cabin. His presidency was kind of cut short because 4 months after his inauguration, he was shot in the back as he's trying to get on a train at a Washington railroad station. I don't remember where he was going, but he was shot in the back. The assassins, I don't know how to say his good. Gautier or something like that. He was angry because he had been rejected for the post of U.S. consul to Paris. He wanted a pretty high paying and prestigious position, and Garfield refused to give it to him, and so he went to the train station and was shot in the back. And this is kind of a funny story, but Alexander Graham Bell had designed a bullet detector. Basically, it was like a metal detector. And they laid him on a bed, and they began to use this bullet detector to try to find the bullet. It was unsuccessful. He ended up dying that summer from an infection. Now, I have heard, I don't know that there's, I'm sure there is somewhere, but I don't have like proof of this anywhere, but I have heard that they were using this metal detector or this bullet detector on him and ended up trying to dig for the bullet in several places because he was lying on a spring mattress, which means this bullet detector was going off on places where the bullet was not because of the springs in the mattress. Okay, so he was assassinated. That's what you need to know. And the other stuff is sort of just an extra thing in there. So he died in September of 1881. He was the 4th president to die in office. He was the 2nd to be assassinated. And we're almost there. All right, Chester A. Arthur becomes president after Garfield is assassinated. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess technically he died from the bullet wound, so he was assassinated. And he becomes the president. This guy was the son of a Baptist minister. The father had immigrated from Ireland. And he really did a couple of things in the White House, but the one that he began to expand on that merit system that you had to earn your positions. Really, the thing that you probably need to remember the most is, well, maybe not the most, but I'm pretty sure the question on the test is that he renovated the White House. His belief was that the White House should be the nation's showpiece. He also started the U.S. Navy. I don't guess started is the correct word, but the modern U.S. Navy. He was the one who sort of pushed this modern U.S. Navy. So renovated the White House, modern Navy. If you will know those two things, you'll be good for Chester A. Arthur. Now, Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 terms. Okay, he serves in 1885 through 1889, but then he comes back and serves again in 1893 through 1897. He was the first Democrat to win the presidency after the Civil War. And that's a pretty big deal because Civil War, the Republicans, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and that Republican Party was the one who stayed as the Union, as the United States. And the South are the ones who separated. So that's who was still in control. For him to come in and be of a different political background and to win the presidency was a pretty big deal for Grover Cleveland. He had a campaign, what's the word? Like Make America Great slogan, tell the truth. And the reality is it was a really, really close run. He carried the last state by just a very few margin of votes. He gets married in the White House. I think he may be, I'm not positive, but he may be the only president to get married in the White House. There's several things in there, but I'm pretty sure the thing that you need to know is that he was the first Democrat to be voted in after the Civil War, and that he served 2 non-consecutive terms. I may not have said that word a few minutes ago. Several presidents have served 2 terms. His 2 terms were not back-to-back. So you have Grover Cleveland, then a guy named Benjamin Harris becomes president. Benjamin Harris was the 23rd president of the United States. And there's a funny story about when Mrs. Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, is walking out of the White House. She told the servants, "I want you to take good care of all of the furniture and the ornaments in the house, for I want to find everything just as it is now when we come back 4 years from today." And she wasn't wrong. What you need to know about him is this thing called the McKinley Tariff. Now, Benjamin Harris is putting it in place, but it's called the McKinley Tariff. Let me kind of explain quickly what this is. In 1890, Congress adopts it's a new protective tariff. And so what a protective tariff is that it taxes foreign goods at a higher rate than American goods to help protect American industry. I can produce items cheaper in China than I can in America for a myriad of reasons. And so what they began to do is they began to tax Chinese products higher so that they were forced to sell them at an equal sell price to help those American products continue to be sold. And this tariff gave a higher degree of protection to American industry than I think any tariff up to that time. I'm not quite sure from there forward what other tariffs came about, but the McKinley Tariff to help protect American goods. And then you have Grover Cleveland again, and his second term. Again, all you need to know is that he served 2 terms. And then you have William McKinley. Now, William McKinley becomes president in 1897. He serves until 1901. And it's interesting because he had a very different, they called it the front porch campaign. If I'm correct, and I think I am, I think his wife was ill, and so he didn't want to be away from home for too long at a time or too far. And so really, he had, like I said, this front porch campaign. You can Google it. You can see pictures of him sitting on his front porch. He was unwilling to leave his wife, and so he did most of his campaign literally from the front porch of his house in Ohio. He had this campaign manager who was a very successful businessman, and he began to combine good business techniques with wise political practices, which this good business sense helps a lot. Honestly, I think that's how Donald Trump got elected before, because he was a good businessman. So he had this Gold Standard Act, which was huge because the Gold Standard Act made gold the sole standard for monetary value. Gold, you had to have gold to back your money. Okay, so front porch campaign and the Gold Standard Act. All right, that's it for your review. If you will have that completely filled out, you are going to have a test. It should be linked right underneath where you found this on, I almost said PayPal, on the portal or on the GroupMe. And it is a timed test. It has to be because of the way it's put together, but it's going to be short answers, so you're going to have to type your answers in. I will tell you this, if you have a phone, you can talk your answers in before you submit them. But if you have all of your answers, information written on your review sheet, you should be good to go.